Over the last 10 years, he has conducted the largest international study on persistent non-symbolic experience, which includes the types of consciousness commonly known as enlightenment, non-duality, and unitive experience. He's an entrepreneur with a background at various intersections of well-being, media, advertising, and technology. He's a best-selling author and an accomplished researcher. I'm delighted to be speaking today to Jeffery Martin. Jeffery, welcome. Thank you very much for being here with us on Happier Talk.
Thank you, Tal. It's great to be here.
So, Jeffery, tell me a little bit about your journey.
Absolutely. Well, about 10 years ago, I was very successful. I had done everything that everybody ever said I should do to be happy. And I wouldn't say that I was unhappy, but there were a lot of people, it was very clear, there were a lot of people that were happier than I was, and that didn't seem really fair given how hard I'd worked, to become happy, quote unquote, right? And so I just decided to leave everything. I sold companies that I was running at the time that I'd built and the whole bit. I was in technology and business. I had degrees in technology and business and stuff like that. And I basically left it all behind and I landed in your class, which was 1508 or something like that. I don't remember quite. That could be right. Which was the positive psychology class at Harvard.
1504.
1504. Okay, that was pretty close.
Yeah,
the other 10 years later, that's not bad.
1508 was the leadership class.
Okay, all right. And so I really wanted to get the best tools that I could. So I was actually going to two schools at the same time. I was attending Harvard in psychology and I was attending CIS actually to pick up a degree in qualitative research because I knew I would need them both in order to understand what I wanted. And that was, I really wanted to go find who the happiest people were and then figure out from there how I could become one of them. It was a very personal, selfish quest, frankly. So wound up narrowing down a population of people that are often thought of as religious and spiritual. People that purport things like persistent mystical experience in Christianity and also Judaism and pretty much all the Abrahamic religions, Islam as well, Sufis and whatnot. Although Sufi is kind of a men's club in some areas of the Middle East these days. It's not quite as mystical as it used to be. Non-duality and things like that from Eastern religions. I really worked all the way around the world, about 1,200 subjects, a huge study all around the world. Spent years sitting down with people, collecting qualitative data from them. We gave them gold standard measures, all the gold standard measures that you would expect across psychology. And all that was really to sort them for things like fMRI and EEG to try to figure out what's going on in their brain and whatnot. So I did that for quite a long time. And these days I talk about the results of that primarily. We basically wound up learning that there were different types of these types of extraordinary well-being experiences. And that it seems like what they primarily do is shift us into what I think is a more appropriate for the modern world sort of way of experiencing the world. If you think about genetics and genetic propagation and things like that, Tony Robbins likes to say we're all 2 million years old because of our genome, right? The geneticists that I talk to say more like 1 million years old to 100,000 years old, depending on the part of the genome. And if you think about that environment, right? Think about just 100,000 years ago. We weren't really at the top of the food chain. You could starve walking to the next berry bush or whatever, right? And that's really, it seems like what humans are wired for. At their deepest level. We have a lot of fear and worry. There's a great sense of scarcity. How much stuff do people accumulate, as a sort of mismatched, this ancient scarcity that's sort of mismatched into modern behavior.
Abundance.
Yeah, exactly. Your boss says you're fired and it feels like a tiger is coming for your arm, but of course you're totally fine.
Yeah.
Right? You're not actually under physical threat. It's just those parts of your nervous system are sort of being shanghaied by the modern equivalents.
Yeah. So what do we do with that mismatch?
Well, it turns out that a very small percentage of the population, we think about 0.5% of the population worldwide, has had a fundamental rewiring in their brain. And we don't need to get geeky or wonky here about what areas of the brain are rewiring or anything like that. But if you do understand the brain, which Harvard taught me very well, fortunately, you can really see how the experience changes based on where the connections sort of atrophy and where new ones are made. And what results from it is a very, very different psychological basis in terms of how you experience the world. One where you feel fundamentally safe, one where you feel whole, one where there isn't a sense of scarcity. And I live in Palo Alto, so we don't even lock our doors half the time in Palo Alto, right? So why should I be living with a psychological baseline of fear and worry and scarcity? And I'm trying to not eat the chocolate at Whole Foods down the street, right? And I'm counting my calories. It's not like should be worried about starving. And so there's a fundamental shift that basically can occur. For the last few years, we've been able to make that shift, and a majority of people who use a research protocol of ours. So we're able to get A/B data for the first time. For a very long time, we could just get B data. We could just basically, I could find you if you purported to be in one of these states, and I could research you, but who you were
you couldn't take a person. But the question is, can you take a person from point A to point B? Meaning, can you help people feel safe? Can you help them be calmer?
We can. I was the first success story, basically, of the research, which is only fair, given that I gave 10 years of my life to it, right?
Yeah. You've earned it.
I lucked into it, let's just say that. So, yeah, we can. We can do it in about 73% of participants at this point. It's a 4-month program, and it's very different than what I originally thought we'd do. Because my experience in technology, right? I mean, I had graduate degrees in business and technology and stuff when I started down this path. And I thought we're going to make a button, we're going to make a brain zapper, we're going to use some sort of neurofeedback. But when the fMRI stuff came back, it was all very deep in the brain. And the reality was that there's really no modern brain stimulation technology. Maybe ultrasound is a comer, sort of. It might be able to do it. We're working with the ultrasound people. But there's no real technology involving neurofeedback unless you have a 64-channel system like we do that can sort of digitize the head right and really get all the paths right. So technology we wound up having to set aside, and I was surprised because I really thought we would get there. We'd find a button or whatever, and we had to actually go back. And I'd never, it's a little embarrassing to admit, but I'd actually never looked at some of the data that we collected. And one of the questions that we asked on our intake forms was, what got you there? And you would think, if I were interested in this, right, that would have been the first question.
Yes.
But the thing is, my sense from the research subjects was that they probably couldn't tell me accurately. And so data like that I just sort of let pile up, but I didn't actually look at. I figured, we'd nail it with fMRI, and then we'd find the button, and then, that would be that. So none of that worked, and we wound up going back. I wound up having a research assistant go back and basically sort all of that data on that question. And it turned out that there was a relatively small number of techniques that people had actually used that they said were successful. Now, interestingly, it's not, if you just know one of those techniques, so if I say, well, one of them is direct inquiry, right, which is this form of asking yourself, who am I, that type of thing, and sort of it's a cognitive approach, if you will. Just you knowing that isn't enough, because a lot of these people had actually tried many, many different things, and many times the same things, and yet the same thing didn't work for everyone. So it was clear there was some sort of matching process there. We had tons of psych data from them, but we could never figure out what could actually match them up. And so what that led to was a 4-month program, essentially, where we just systematically put people through each one of them, trying to help them find the one that is the one that really clicks for them.
And the one that clicks then has an impact immediately, within a week, a month?
That's really the stunning thing. It has an impact almost immediately. So when I was doing the pilot, you've been through all the same training I have, right? And so our pilot was 6 people, because I had to make sure that I didn't make them crazy, and that if they did go crazy, we could psychologically support them, right? So there were only 6 people. 5 people finished, and I had it set. I was thinking this is going to be a 2 to 5 year project. I had the whole data collection set for this longitudinal data collection effort, right? But it wound up that all 5 of the people who stayed in the study actually transitioned during the study. I mean, you can't imagine how much I questioned them and doubted them. And, I mean, I would have said that was impossible.
And did you measure their brains?
We couldn't measure that group's brains because we weren't equipped to do it at the time, but we've done that in subsequent groups.
And you're seeing real difference after 4 months?
Yeah, well, in some cases, it's even a week. I mean, if you luck out and your method is in the first week, then each week there's a weekly report that they send in, and what you say in that weekly report can be mind-blowing, even just in the first week.
So what are some of these techniques?
The interesting thing is that there are things that have, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, risen to the top of the list over the centuries. So even though these aren't, I don't no longer think of these as, I think of these as psychological states. right? So I don't think of these as religious states, or I think it's great that those are the institutions that could go between cultures and pass down knowledge over time, without it being wiped out because an empire got wiped out or whatever, right? So they've been fantastic transmission mechanisms for this knowledge, but I don't really think that the experience necessarily has to do with religious or spiritual. And the reason for that is because about 300 of our subjects got there from depression, got there from suicidal depression, essentially. And the razor blade was like right here, and then switched, which I remembered something, I've never forgot this. There was a point in your class back in school where you were talking about PTSD one week, and then you were talking about the opposite. You had like a suspicion that there was this opposite, and I've forgotten the term. I wanted to remember that term forever.
Post-peak experience order, PPEO.
Okay, PPEO. I'm glad to see you again just to get that term, because I've told people about that story for years, and I'm like, but I can't remember the term. And so that was really, I think, related to sort of that, nothing, you're self-objectifying yourself enormously by the time you've decided to end your subjective self, right? And so it makes sense that something magical could sort of happen in that moment. And of course, it's a tiny percentage of people that those happen to. So anyway, but the techniques for the people who are actually trying to get there, they were really things that are quite well known. And so Buddhist noting, for instance.
Say more.
So noting is you just describing your moment-to-moment experience. So if I'm noting right now, I might say pressure, hearing, heat, things like that, right? If pressure was my butt in the chair, hearing was how loud the environment is.
Which is also a technique that cognitive psychology has adopted over the years.
Absolutely, as they've done with a lot of these that were sort of worked out for hundreds of years. Now, some of them are newer. Like there's one called Headless Way. And it was funny because I would sit down with research subjects, and oftentimes, these were people who had been trying to reach this place forever, right? For decades. And so they'd be like, well, I practiced blah, 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 Tibetan Buddhism, such and such, for 25 years, and then I did whatever for another 10 years, and then I did Headless Way. And you're like, what was that? Right? Headless Way. Right? And it was basically like Headless Way is this very interesting technique where you point to the floor, say, and you pay attention, you say, okay, there's the floor, and the floor is out there, and then you get a little closer, look at your foot, your leg, your chest, and then you point here, and you're like, what's that actually pointing at experientially? And there's a sense of sort of, it shifts people. There's a sense that you're like pointing at nothing, and yet that's clearly like where experience seems to be,
And it also has to do with the Buddhist idea of the observer.
Right.
So you become the observer at that point, and
Right.
then you realize the true nature of reality.
Yeah, and you're like trying to define what that observer, you're pointing at this thing, and you're like, how do I even define this? And it's for the most people, the first time they've ever noticed it. Right? There's a temptation to say, I'm pointing at my face, right? But then you say, well, can you see your face? No, okay, well, what is it that you're actually pointing at then? And so that technique, it turns out to be an incredibly effective technique for people who've tried all sorts of other stuff, but they're always a little like shy about copping to the fact that it wasn't like their 25 years of Tibetan Buddhist practice or something that actually flipped the switch for it,
Yeah. Can you mention some other techniques?
Oh, sure. Mantras, especially TM-style mantras. We use a style called Ascension mantras in the program because they're English, and I just think it's helpful for people to hear them in English rather than like a name of a Hindu god.
words with meaning?
In this case, they have meaning, but the real issue, so there's lots of different ways to do mantras, right? You can just repeat them in your head, like 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, right?
Or calm, or
calm,
relax,
calm.
or happy.
But the way that these work is that essentially you say them, so you might say, and this isn't one of them, but you might say 1, and then you sort of pause, and you wait for 1. You wait for that, the flavor of that word to sort of pass, and then you sort of bring your attention back to it. And then you again sort of wait. And so it's not like a standard repetitive type of mantra, it's a certain type of mantra. And so mantras, direct inquiry I've already mentioned, noting I've mentioned. Actually Goenka style Vipassana, these 10-day Vipassana retreats, they're, in our research data, they're the most effective thing for giving people a temporary glimpse of experience. Mindfulness is in there.
And how do you make that temporary glimpse a permanent state?
Well, that's really what most of the other techniques do, not so much the Goenka Vipassana stuff. Originally, this was a 6-week program when I was first messing around with it, because there were just a handful of these techniques, right? But what we learned was that some of them, like Theravada noting, like that noting that I said a minute ago, and the mantra stuff, those can produce dark nights for some people, which are sort of the dark night of the soul experience, you know, which is, if you look at Willoughby Brown's work at Brown, Willoughby Britton's work at Brown, she's actually specialized in this. And when I first met Willoughby, it was outside some conference that we were both speaking at, some academic conference, and she was in a dark night. And I sent her to like one of my research subjects to see what he could do with her. And then that was great because she got out of it, and then she's been studying it ever since, and she has fantastic data in all of this. But so these can last for years, even decades, these dark night periods. So they can be very, very short. Obviously, from a research ethics standpoint, you can't have a protocol that induces that, right? So we had to spend about a year figuring out what are these dark night things and how do we work around them.
Yeah, and because so, I know that is what many people report, that they went through the worst period of their lives and then they emerged different.
And in our data, it was clear that like if nobody that we sat down with us that did direct inquiry talked about dark nights. Right? And so it didn't seem like it was some necessary piece of the pie that you just, you know, you didn't have a whole pie unless you had the dark night slice in there or whatever. So we thought, okay, that must not be necessary. So let's figure out how to engineer our way around that.
So does it turn out to be necessary or not?
No, not at all.
Not necessary, but in some situations that
in some situations it happens. But we use noting and we use the mantra style stuff, which induces dark nights in a lot of people, without it inducing dark nights. So what we found out about how to sort of mitigate the dark night problem is that there wound up being two important factors in that. The first is that people who are happy, people who have a higher sense of well-being, we use like all the UPenn measures and stuff like that. You take 3 hours of measures before the program, in the middle of the program, and after. Sometimes we're nice in the middle of the program, but you take them at a minimum before and after, right? And then if you live in the San Francisco area, you come to our lab for 64-channel scans. And if not, then these days we're using like the Muse, and we're using a GSR device, and we're using a heart strap, and we're connecting that through Neuromor's app, and so we're collecting physiological data in addition.
And are you just collecting data or using it as biofeedback?
Right now we're just collecting it. We're looking for we're looking for stuff in there. We're just getting to the point where after this cohort, we'll probably have enough to start feeding into machine learning to really look for the stuff that human eyes just haven't been able to pick up, you know, if it's actually in there.
So if I want to learn more about your program, if I want to go through this program,
if you want to learn more about our research, you can go to non-symbolic.org, which is sort of the academic epicenter that's held that for 10 years now. If you want to participate in the research, you can go to finderscourse.com. And if you're interested in technology and well-being, where all that is going, we curate that in the Valley, basically. We have a large conference that we do every year called the Transformative Technology Conference, so that's ttconf.org. There's a Transformative Technology Lab at Sophia University, transtechlab.org. You know, like all of us, I have a million domain names these days.
Right. Well, thank you very much for this important work.
Well, thank you.